right. I think we're live now. All right, Charlie, do you want to introduce us, get us going?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Charlie Gomez. My co-hosts here are Joe Cohen and Hongwei Zhu, and we have Laura Nelson from Northeastern University, and she will be presenting her work in progress entitled "And the Rest is History." And I was actually just commenting what a great title that is for someone who can't come up with titles to save themselves on any paper. So I really appreciate that. It's a rare skill. Laura is an assistant professor of sociology at Northeastern University, where she's part of the core faculty at the NU Lab for Text Maps and Networks. She's also affiliated at the Network Science Institute at Northeastern and is on the executive committee for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Prior to Northeastern, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Berkeley Institute for Data Science and Digital Humanities, and at the Management Organizations Department at Northwestern University, where she was also affiliated with the NICO, the Northwestern Institute on Complex Systems. So she uses computational tools, primarily text analysis, to study social movements, culture, gender, institutions, and organizations. Her work can be found in mobilization, gender and society, sociological methods and research, sociological methodology, as well as the Oxford University Press, among other outlets. And she gives many talks and does many workshops on computational social science here and abroad. And we are really excited to hear your new work. And this work is sort of, it's a work in progress. So we're also eager to kind of workshop some of the ideas that you have around there. So everyone, we are a very friendly bunch. We like to kind of get our hands dirty. So we were definitely excited to give Laura some great feedback on her work in progress.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this. Let me share. Oh, I don't have permissions. Oh, I do have permissions to share my screen.
Good. I'll be there in about 15 minutes, sweetie.
All right, so I want to talk today about history, unsurprisingly. So most of you probably recognize this picture and this person. This is, of course, Rosa Parks, who is well known for kind of kickstarting the modern civil rights movement when she refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white man. And the Montgomery bus boycott followed, which was the initial event that they commonly say that started the civil rights movement. So this picture, of course, is not a real picture of the event. It's a stage picture. It was staged and taken after the event in order to commemorate the event, which was a common occurrence during this era. That there's an interesting story of that white guy sitting behind her, which is fun to look up if you're interested. But this is a picture that I think a lot of people would recognize, and perhaps a lot of people would think that this was the actual event, but it's not. It's a staged event. And this motivates kind of my interest in history and how we remember history and how we think about history. I think it's a good example of kind of how history is made and remembered by people. So most of you probably recognize Rosa Parks. Some of you may recognize this woman, but maybe not all of you. This is Racy Taylor. So Rosa Parks actually got her start in civil rights organizing in the anti-sexual harassment movement. So she did a lot of work on the harassment and rape cases of Black women in the South, and Racy Taylor was one of her big early cases. So she was sexually assaulted pretty gruesomely by a group of white men, and Rosa Parks took up her case, and that got her really well known in the area for her work there. There's books written about her now, but books about Racy Taylor now, but she's not as well known as Rosa Parks in the role in the civil rights movement. And most of you probably don't recognize that third picture, Claudette Colvin. So she was a 15-year-old girl and did the same thing Rosa Parks did a few years earlier. She refused to give up her seat on the bus. And of course, we don't commemorate her the way we do Rosa Parks. And there was hundreds, if not thousands, of other people who did the exact same act that Rosa Parks did, got arrested for it, and haven't been kind of enshrined in our historical memory the way that Rosa Parks had. So this is generally how history works. Some events are simply more important to history. Some events get enshrined in history. Some events people and ideas get enshrined in our historical or history books, and some don't. Some are kind of lost to the historical archives or dustbin history, if we want to go Marx here. So my question today, and this kind of motivating question for this new project I'm working on, is what gets written into the history books. And as Charles was saying, this is very preliminary. I've been wanting to do this project for years, so I'm excited that I have the time and opportunity to do it now. So I'm basically going to present a bunch of descriptive stuff, descriptive statistics that I have, and some descriptive text stuff. And I'm hoping to really just brainstorm with you guys about the next steps, what's interesting to you and what's not, what I could possibly do going forward to kind of shape this into a more not systematic, but into a project that makes sense for sociology, the sociology of knowledge, and our understanding of women's movements over time and how they get remembered. So that's where I am. And I'm very happy to be interrupted if something sticks out to you. That's really what I want to get here, is if you see something and you're like, wow, that's fascinating. I want to know that, because that's kind of what will shape how I go forward. Me and I'm working with 2 graduate students on this, so they're very eager to hear what you think of this here. All righty. So the way we get history today is probably not through history books. If we're thinking outside of the school format, it's probably Google. So if you're interested in learning the history, or you're reminding yourself about a historical thing that you want to put in a paper, you probably put it into Google or another search engine. And more recently, what we've been seeing is Wikipedia tends to be the first hit. So Wikipedia is the first hit here, and it gives us some key facts. Rosa Parks was in the civil rights movement. She's known for the Montgomery bus boycott, her occupation as a civil rights activist, etc. And even more so, and this is, I don't know, past maybe year or two, Google has been actually putting like a pull-out box on the right side of your search screen that pulls information from Wikipedia and kind of puts it there as the authoritative source on the subject that you're searching for. This doesn't work for everything you search for, but a lot of time that's what you get. And not only does it just kind of pull out the images and the screenshot of it, you start to see some things. Oh, she's the first lady of civil rights, the mother of the freedom movement. So if you're searching for history, this is what you see right away on Google. You see Wikipedia, and then you see this pull out of Wikipedia with all of these details on it. So, not surprisingly, I am very interested in Wikipedia. What is Wikipedia doing? How is it conveying these historical movements? If people go to Wikipedia to find information about history, what are they seeing? And does it match up with the way history was actually created? Does it match up with what the people who were involved in creating those movements and moments were thinking is important, what they were fighting for? How does that translation process happen? And the bigger questions are, how does that impact the way we understand history, think about history, etc. So there's a lot of really interesting questions, I think, that we can dig into with Wikipedia. And Wikipedia data, they're great. They're open with their data. They release it all. So it's a really fantastic resource for a lot of computational social science work coming out recently and for about 10 years now. And the other thing is,
I have a quick clarifying question. So I would imagine Rosa Parks obviously probably has a very extensive and very, very well cited Wikipedia entry. I'm also wondering about the other 2 individuals, right? So these other figures who were involved in sort of like, in Montgomery, because like obviously, Rosa Parks was already sort of a somewhat semi-prominent figure, but these other figures who came before her, I'm assuming that they don't necessarily have a Wikipedia page.
Yeah, Claudette Colvin does not. Racy Taylor might now at this point, because that book was written on her recently. But that's exactly what I'm interested in. That is precisely the question I'm interested in, is yes, Rosa Parks is an obvious one, right? She's going to have her own Wikipedia page. Claudette Colvin doesn't. Racy Taylor might. And that's precisely what I want to measure, is what ideas and organizations and people get their own Wikipedia page, who doesn't, and what does that means. So that's precisely why I'm going to this Wikipedia page. And the problem with a lot of social movement research, and specifically historical research, is the survivor bias,
right?
And the selecting on the dependent variable. We know what survived because it's in the history books and we read about it. We don't know as much about what didn't survive. So when you're looking at why was Rosa Parks popular, you don't know about all of the other Rosa Parks that weren't, right? So it becomes very tricky, and Doug McAdam has some good work on selecting on the dependent variable. So one of the things that we can do with these new methods and new sources of data, although it's not perfect and not super easy, but we can try to get around the survivor bias and say, yes, It's great to look at the ideas that survived. We also want to find those ideas, people, etc., that did not survive. They did not persist. So that's the motivation here, is that Wikipedia is super extensive. There's 6 billion articles in English on Wikipedia. I mean, it's probably the most extensive just resource for anything that you would want to look up. And it's really, really highly trafficked. Like, it's the second most trafficked site in the United States, second only to YouTube, which actually surprised me that YouTube was more trafficked than Wikipedia, but over 1 trillion people click on Wikipedia every month. So it's really important, and it's also extensive. So this is like the best case scenario. If something is going to be recorded, it's probably going to be recorded in Wikipedia. So if, Racy Taylor has a page there because it's so extensive and so many people are working on it, she probably doesn't get a page in a historical textbook on the movement, for example. So yeah, best case scenario, Wikipedia, if it's out there, if it's being recorded, it will be recorded in Wikipedia. But as I will show, some stuff don't make it into Wikipedia. And I think that's important. That's what I'm interested in. Yeah. I'm only looking at English language stuff here, but there's a lot of opportunity to do cross-language analyses as well for people who are ambitious in looking at cross-language stuff. All right, so we have Wikipedia. The motivating question then for me is, what ideas, people, and organizations from the early women's movement are present in contemporary Wikipedia? So fairly simple question. What is there? What is not there? And also, what metadata is correlated with the presence or absence of the idea, person, or organization? So really trying to dig into what explains it, what are the patterns between what is there and what is not there, to really think about why some things persist and get kind of enshrined in our historical memory and what doesn't. So that's the two broad motivating questions here for me. So the data for the women's movement side, which is tricky to get in any systematic way, as anyone who's done historical research knows, comes from the Alexander Street collection called Women and Social Movements in the United States, 1600 to 2000. So this is a collection that consists, it's an online collection, so it's digitized, which is great for me because I do computational stuff. It consists of about 120,000 pages of primary source collections. And there are, of course, important features of this collection that impact the interpretation of the analysis. So the collections and the sources were selected by the founding editors of this collection for their relevance to this specific collection. And in particular, they wanted to focus on the diversity of the movement. So they're purposefully collecting documents. So already we're throwing out a bunch of ideas that existed, a bunch of stuff that existed in the women's movement in that first selection process. So they went and they were trying to be extensive. It's an online database, so it's extensible, meaning they can add as much as they want. They're not constrained by the length of a textbook, for example. So there's a lot of resources there, but it's highly curated and highly selected. So we already are starting off with a selection bias going into it, but we got to start somewhere. So this
it sounds like this stuff is also OCR'd too. So like this would also makes it, that's great.
Yeah, it's not even just OCR'd, it's corrected OCR'd.
Oh, nice.
So it's 100%, I mean, more or less 100% accurate, which is a huge benefit. I have done projects on OCR text and it's a nightmare. So that's another benefit of this collection, is it's corrected because it's online. You can look at the actual text online. It's not just the images, it's the actual text online.
That's
you can
amazing.
Copy and paste from it. So it's corrected. Yeah. So it's a really nice resource. And thankfully, my university subscribes to it. So I was able to purchase the actual underlying data behind it, which is fantastic. So this is a description of the documents that were actually available to me via so I purchased an XML file that contained all the documents. So it's kind of a little bit of a hodgepodge of curated documents from a variety of women's movement stuff here. And it's, the number of documents is quite different. So I'm focusing on the primary source documents. So the ones that were written by people who were involved in the movement. So writings of Black women suffragists, etc. That's the kind of selection. So we go from the selection of which documents are included in this collection to which documents I can actually get in the full text readable format, which I think is everything that they have on the website. and then selected further to the primary source documents, the writings by the actual women. So that gets 120,000 documents, gets boiled down to just over 1,000 documents. I also did a little bit of curating here to narrow the time frame just for this initial analysis. So just looking at 1898 to 1954. So sorry, Joe, we're not going to go to 4 centuries of women's movement activists, but trying to get some comparable analysis going. So writings of Black women suffragists, and I narrowed it to 1898 to 1954. I do have earlier writings from that collection that I could use. The Equal Rights Journal is the journal of the National Woman's Party, which is a largely white, largely middle to upper class, in some ways quite racist women's organization. And so they champion the Equal Rights Amendment, et cetera. And then the National Consumers League is a working class women's organization. So they focus on the rights of working class women, trying to think through how that we can ease burdens on working class women and provide more rights for them. So they were often in direct competition with the Equal Rights, the National Women's Party. So directly competing, like fighting over bills and such. So it's 3 very different collections, different perspectives on the same movement here. So that's my collection. The first step then, when we have the women's movement data, is identifying ideas. And this computationally is not trivial. It's actually quite difficult. So just think for a moment with me about the steps it would take to identify ideas in a text. Like think about reading through a text. How would you say this is an idea? How would you bound the idea in the text and say this is a discrete idea? I'm not talking about themes. So we know we can use things like topic models to pull out themes. We can use word embedding models to pull out the ways in which words are used and the relational distance between words. So we have all of that, but I want discrete ideas. I want, this is an idea that we can look to see that was present in the women's movement and may or may not be present in Wikipedia and the history books as I'm measuring it. So it's a tricky problem. And I think we're doing better as a community at identifying this, but this initially, when I started doing computational methods, this is what I wanted to do. And then very quickly I was like, wow, this is nearly impossible. I'm not going to do this. But I'm back to it, thinking through how we can identify these discrete ideas in the text. And the best way that I know of is through key phrase extraction, which is a very common and by now actually quite good way of extracting phrases from text. So I used the RAKE algorithm, which is one of the older key phrase extraction algorithms. So it stands for Rapid Automatic Keyword Extraction. It uses a list of stop words. It uses phrase delimiters. I did not make this slide. I borrowed this slide. And I'm going to kind of hand wave over the math here, which I don't think is particularly important here. But the idea is it detects the most relevant words or phrases in a piece of text. So it's not the most frequent. It is the most quote unquote relevant. And some phrase extraction algorithms use Wikipedia to identify phrases. So they take phrases from Wikipedia as a way to kind of train the algorithm to identify these common phrases. I, of course, don't want to do that, right? I don't want to have Wikipedia as both on both sides of the equation. So that's why I didn't use some of the more kind of sophisticated new algorithms to do this, because I do not want to condition the phrases that I extract from the original text based on whether they appeared in Wikipedia. It would just, throw off exactly what I'm trying to do. So going to the good old trusty early RAKE algorithm to identify these phrases.
Laura, can I ask a quick clarifying question on RAKE? So is it the case that does it sort of have like a preset bag of words that were like the sort of pre-identified phrases, or is it sort of unique to each corpus? So for instance, like I know it's not necessarily like a TF-IDF or anything like that. Like it's coming into it, I guess it sounds like based on Wikipedia. Like these are sort of like very common ideas, or not ideas, but phrases that have already been identified in sort of this wider body of knowledge vis-a-vis Wikipedia. Is that right?
Not RAKE. So other phrase extraction algorithms do that.
Not RAKE though. Okay.
Not RAKE. RAKE looks at stop words and looks at other ways of bounding phrases. And you, as the user, you input the number of words you want to look for. So I did everything from unigrams up to, I think, 5-word phrases. So you can distinguish how many, or you can specify what types of n-grams you want. So yeah, I did 1 to 5.
Okay.
And then it uses algorithm, a system of
Yeah,
rules based on stop words, based on some other kind of components of phrases. It does not, unlike these other phrase extraction algorithms, it does not use a list of phrases from Wikipedia. So like it doesn't use Wikipedia titles, for example, to
Oh, that's super neat.
condition it. Yeah, so in another project, I use a different phrase extraction algorithm that is conditioned on Wikipedia, but I just can't, for obvious reasons, can't do that.
Yeah.
Not can, I don't want to do that here.
Right.
Yeah, so this is really just stop words, other phrase delimiters. I think there's some TF-IDF stuff going on as well.
Neat.
Actually, no, it's not, because it's individual text. It only looks at individual text, so there is no TF-IDF stuff going on.
Okay.
It's just stop words.
Got it.
But what it does is, it takes, so it goes text by text. So it's single text by single text. And this is two examples of text here with the paragraph separation there. It would take that as input, and then it extracts these phrases. So United States, rights of women teachers is what I would think of as an idea in the women's movement, focusing on the rights of women teachers, or women teachers as a phrase, opposed legislation, equal pay measure, and city of Boston. So it identifies places, New York, boards of education, teachers equal pay bill. It identifies names like Fairfax Brown, Miss Mary Cromwell, locations, Ann Arbor, Michigan, etc. So it's a wide variety of things, and some of them, in my eyes, represent discrete ideas, concepts, people that the women's movement was proposing, and some of them are pretty generic, like City of Boston and New York. So it does have to be filtered, and we filtered it by hand. So this method extracted 23,000-ish phrases, and me and my trusty grad students went by and just filtered it, which is relevant or not relevant, or relevant but may need to be corrected, because there was some corrections that needed or not, which sounds like a lot, but that is a human-sized problem. We could do it in about 5 hours of work each, which to me is not much. That does pose the problem of scalability, of course. So if I decided, oh, I want to add more text here, or I want a different corpus to look at, you have to go through that process again. So I think there is still a lot of work. I mean, I can't think of a computational way to solve that. Separating out the City of Boston from teachers equal pay bill, that's really quite tricky to do. Perhaps you could use Wikipedia for that, but it gets a little bit tricky. So it's done by hand. And in general, when I use computational methods, I find that filtering lists is very quick and very effective. So my preferred approach is to use computational methods to pull out relevant lists of words. So in one project, I look at verbs and verb phrases to capture tactics, and then just filter the verbs and verb phrases for tactic or not. I find it's a really great way to identify kind of lists of words. And Gary King and some other psychologists have that same philosophy. We're really terrible at coming up with words in a category. If I were to say, name all the animals, you would name like 5, and then you would panic and you'd be like, I don't know any animals. But if I gave you a list and said, pull out all the animals, you would do it very effectively and very quickly. So for people who are venturing into these types of computational projects, filtering lists is great. Making lists is terrible. So computational methods to make lists, humans can filter lists. So after filtering the phrase list, the types of phrases we're focusing on are actors, Ida B. Wells, people, organization, like the National Women's Party, and kind of groups of actors, American feminists, movement structures and events, so things that make movements go and what they do on kind of a day-to-day basis, or who is doing that stuff. So city council, women's committees, Seneca Falls conventions. These are not strict codes. We didn't like attach a code to each one of these phrases, but just generally the kind of framework we were using that we found emerged from these phrases to help us classify whether they were relevant or not. Constituencies, working women, married teachers, French women, so like groups of people that the movement was focusing on. Grievances and targets, race prejudice, maternal death, canneries was a frequent target of the early women's movement, thinking about workers' rights in canneries, for example, and then ideas. So specific ideas like accident compensation, specific acts and bills like the Shepard-Towner Act, or more kind of generic ideas like social uplift, which was a very important concept in the Black women's movement in this period, or equal rights, which was an important concept for the white women's movement in this period. So things like that. And then specific public sphere institutions, which is a bit of a tricky category, but the AME Church was very important to the women's movement, and then universities were very important. So, who knows if they were relevant to the movement or not, but they were at least mentioned in the women's movement documents here. So that's the range of types of ideas that come through this algorithm. And we ended up with about 5,700 unique phrases. And these phrases occurred about 15,000 times in the corpus. So they were used on average about 3 times each in the corpus. So now we've gone from corpus to 23,000 phrases to 5,700 phrases that we thought were relevant to the women's movement here. All right, now comes the descriptive statistics. So this is who provided the ideas. So the Equal Rights Journal provided, in this sense, 3,000 of the phrases come from the Equal Rights Journal, et cetera, over the 3 groups. And the Equal Rights Journal used the phrases quite a bit more often. So of these 3,000 phrases, they used it close to 10,000 times in their corpus. So there's some distribution in who is providing the phrases, which is interesting and potentially consequential. And then here are the frequent phrases from each of these groups. And I've just put in orange ones that I think are kind of interesting. So National Consumers League, not surprisingly, is looking at labor laws, union, education, et cetera. The Equal Rights Journal, Equal Rights Amendment, not surprisingly, status, which is probably have to do with the commissions on the status of women, which they talked about a lot, freedom, education, family. In the Black writings, we unsurprisingly get like colored women, Negro women. War was a big topic, Civil War. Freedom, slavery, community, body was interesting. And I was looking into how body showed up, which was, I think, an interesting phrase. So there's a lot you could do just simply looking at the difference in the types of topics and phrases these women's groups were talking about. And Black women, I think, are undersold in their role that they played in the first wave women's movement. It was really huge, and it was much different than the role that these white middle-class women were playing. So just in terms of like digging into what are the different things that these groups found important is one thing that we can do before we even get to Wikipedia with these phrases that we're looking at. Here's the same thing, but I'm looking only at 2 grams and up. So just throwing out the unigrams here. Similar thing, child labor amendment, 8-hour days, not surprisingly focused on labor here. Jury service, the jury rights movement was big for the equal rights for the National Women's Party. We get feminist movement here, and the feminist movement was largely only mentioned by the National Women's Party. The word feminism was not used by Black women. It was not used by the National Consumers League, which is interesting. And we know that second wave feminist, Black second wave feminist a lot of them refused to use the word feminist and use the word womanist. And this goes back into history. This goes back to the 1900s when the word feminist was first imported to the United States from France. So there's an interesting historical origin story there. And then over here, we get industrial education, training schools. So this is following the Booker T. Washington kind of philosophy of industrial education, that type of kind of economic focus. The Tuskegee Institute is important here. So we're seeing that focus come there as well. All right, so those were the phrases. So now we'll shift to Wikipedia. Which of these showed up in Wikipedia? So in all of the phrases, all of the pages in Wikipedia, and this is the full text, not just the title, just around 90% of these phrases showed up in Wikipedia, which is great, I think, which means 10% of them did not, but 90% did. And there's not much difference across these 3 groups here in which phrases, in the amount or proportion of phrases that showed up.
And sorry, this is across the entire body of knowledge of Wikipedia. So like
English
language. So like whether it's Rosa Parks or talking about like hydrochemical, what have you, like these are phrases that popped up. Okay.
Yep, yeah, that's right. And some of the phrases are pretty generic, like abdominal muscles was a phrase that came out in the women's movement writing, which does in fact show up in Wikipedia, but not necessarily in relation to the women's movement,
right?
Which is why I took this second step. Yeah, abdominal muscles. There was a lot about women's bodies, and that actually has to do with healthcare. So a lot about the healthcare of women, reproductive issues and such. So that's why, and that exactly tees me up to look at this second graph, which is, I don't want to just look at all pages, but were these issues mentioned in any page that was on a history page? It doesn't have to be history of the women's movement, just a history page. So it contains history in the title, or it contains movement in the title. So it's an attempt to narrow down Wikipedia into more of a history book format. So if you read an article, you don't know what you want to search for. You just want to know, what is the history of the suffrage movement? You go to the suffrage movement page. And just a note here that I do get the page titles that redirect. So one page on Wikipedia tends to have 3 or 4 pages that redirect to it. And so I am searching through all of those titles, not just the title that it ends up on, but all of the pages that then redirect. So the history of women's suffrage is a title, but it redirects to women's suffrage. So just a note there, but I do have all of those titles. So this is an attempt to say, not only do the phrases show up in Wikipedia, but if you were reading a page on some sort of historical thing, would you see these phrases in there? And here we see it's now reduced down to about 60% of the phrases show up in a history or movement page on Wikipedia, which in my eyes is still quite high, but it still leaves a full 40% of these phrases that are not showing up in the history pages here.
Just to quickly clarify, so is it? I just want to make sure. So I thought it was a tag on the Wikipedia pages, like you label your article as, okay, this is related to history, or this is related to social movement. Is that right? Or?
No, this is not from tags. This is from the actual title. So does the word history or does the word movement appear in the title of the page? There are tags. So Wikipedia is tagged with things like feminist or movement or women's issues. That could be an alternative route. I was looking at that and it was not, it didn't make sense to me why some things were tagged as feminist and some things not. It was pretty weird, but I do want to look more into using those tags, those metadata tags. So I think that is something that's potentially a next step. And if anybody here has done research using Wikipedia data, I would love to hear your opinion on the usability of those tags and how systematic they are, because it really, just doing some spot checking, I was like, wow, that's kind of a weird list of feminist pages. So that's why I didn't use those. So I'm just going for interpretability and simplicity, which just saying, does history or movement show up in the title?
Are these titles also contributed by internet users or?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. But they do try to do some, Wikipedia has a bunch of style guides. They're pretty strict about what gets included and what doesn't. And they will, the actual people who work for Wikipedia will change things if it doesn't fit their style guide. They'll either do it by hand or do it by a bot. So it's pretty controlled, especially the titles, but everything about Wikipedia is pretty controlled. But yeah, everything is contributed by the editors. So people can add pages and decide on the title, and yeah, it's users. And then this third way of slicing the data was actually looking at the titles. So this is all page titles, not the history or movement. And the question is, do the phrase show up in the title of the page? Why is this important? Well, when you do a Google search, if the phrase is in the title, it's most likely to be that first hit that you see, and it's most likely to have that little call out box on the right side. So if it's not in the page title, the page is going to be further down in your search terms, and you might even have to add the term wiki in there to get the page. So it is important if the phrase is in the title versus not. It impacts the way people read and find out about information. And so now we're hovering between 54 to 58% of the phrases are in at least one page title. And again, across all of these, there's not much difference, and none of this is statistically significant, the differences here, across these 3 collections. So this is kind of the meta view of what's happening with these phrases in Wikipedia. Here are some of the phrases that are not in Wikipedia. So minimum wage boards, industrial hygiene bureaus, child wage earners is not there, mandatory minimum wage law, jury service bill, surprisingly to me, was not in Wikipedia, and anti-lynching bureau. Ada Young Auxiliary is a pretty niche group that was important to the Black women's movement, Lucy Stone, Civic League, etc. So just these are some examples of phrases that are not in Wikipedia at all, at least the way we searched for it. Oh, and by the way, we searched for the phrase using Elasticsearch. So we did an edit distance. So it didn't have to be the exact phrase. We allowed an edit distance of 1 for each word. So if there were 3 words, we allowed an edit distance of 3. And if there were 2 words, we allowed an edit distance of 2. So there was some room for different spellings, etc., but not much. So it was constrained, but that's how we did the search of Wikipedia with these phrases. And of course, lowercase did and all of that stuff. Here are some phrases that were in Wikipedia, but not in the history of the movement pages. So some interesting things here. Jim Crow car, which was really, really important to the early Black women's movement, does not show up in any history page in Wikipedia, although it does show up in Wikipedia. So if you were searching through enough pages, you would find it, but it's not really connected to the women's movement. Social uplift and nobler ideals were also really, really key concepts to the Black women's movement that don't show up in these history pages here. Same over here. Pure food law was very important to the National Consumers League, night work, etc., that don't show up in these history pages on Wikipedia. So what then is lost to history? And this is where I need your folks' help and where I'm getting a little stuck. So how do I characterize or figure out what's going on with these phrases? And it's between 10 to 40%, depending on how you slice the data, that don't show up in Wikipedia. My initial kind of look through it, and I did some word counts, I did some frequency counts, I just did some qualitative look. For Black women, it's specific. I mean, the general theme is specificity, which is not surprising. That the specificity is lost, but the type of specificity is different across these groups. So for Black women, it was specific clubs, organization, and departments that were the most likely to not show up in Wikipedia. For the Equal Rights Journal, so this is the National Women's League, the National Women's Party, it was specific commissions, bills, and treaties. And then for the National Consumers League, it was specific commissions, laws, and types of employment. So a lot of the specific industries that they were focusing on does not get mentioned in their pages on Wikipedia. So just to show one case study of this, one of the things I can do is identify phrases that have a specific word for, so departments. What departments are being mentioned? This is easy to do computationally, so I just was curious if we break it down to specific types of ideas, do we see differences across groups? So I'm looking at any phrase that mentions the word department or departments. And now we start to see some more systematic differences. So in all pages, 100% of the departments mentioned by the Equal Rights Journal was somewhere in Wikipedia. And there's some drop off in these other groups, but here we start to see a big difference. So while around 50% in the Equal Rights Journal and National Consumers League were mentioned in one of these history pages, only 35% from the Black women's groups were mentioned in these history pages. And a lot of that has to do with things like the Negro department, which is not mentioned in these kind of race issues that we don't associate with the women's movement. Race is separate from the women's movement. And we're starting to see that a lot here, where we don't see a lot of these departments that maybe are not gender specific, but still were crucial to the Black women's movement. We're not seen in Wikipedia. So here are some of the departments that are missing. So again, color department, Negro department, but there's some other ones, citizenship department as well. So immigration was a huge part of the early women's movement. And that a little bit gets lost to the history as well. This focus on immigration and nationality, etc. here. And then this is Wikipedia titles. So not surprisingly, these phrases don't show up in the history page titles because they're generic titles like the history of the women's movement, the history of the colored women's. So they're not going to show up in the history pages title, but we see a pretty big difference here where 70% of the departments mentioned by the Equal Rights Journal get their own Wikipedia page, where only 40% of the departments mentioned by the Black writers get their own page. So now we're starting to see, if you're kind of searching through Wikipedia, it would be much easier to find information on these departments versus the ones that were important to the Black women's movement here. So that here we're starting to see a little evidence that there is actually systematic differences that don't get picked up when you're looking at the phrases as a whole here. So very preliminary takeaways, and all of this may change in the coming months as I dig deeper into this. I'm convinced and still convinced that Wikipedia is a really fantastic resource. I think it's just an incredible source of knowledge for our world, and they're so open to making it better, and they do campaigns to add more pages. So I think it's just something that we should celebrate and look at more. Still, 10% of the phrases, which is about 500 phrases, are not present in Wikipedia. And this, I'm going to do some more cleaning, so this number will likely go down. So it's pretty dang impressive how comprehensive Wikipedia is in covering this movement. And certainly if we went back to the 1600s, we might find something different, but at least for the modern stuff, it's pretty good. Not surprisingly, specificity is missing. And what's interesting to me is the type of specificity is different across subgroups. So specific councils, which I didn't show, and departments mentioned by Black women are less likely to be in Wikipedia. This has to do with what these women were talking about. So this is also a difference in what the women were proposing across these different communities, not just in what Wikipedia is covering. So it's both what Wikipedia is covering, but also what the women were finding important that is different across these. And I think that suggests that there are some interesting patterns in this data, which there may be other systematic differences in what's missing across subgroups of ideas. And again, this is where I'm a little bit, this is where I am now is, all right, I have these lists of phrases that don't show up in Wikipedia across these three clusters. I don't have recourse to my normal tools. Topic models you can't do on phrases. Word embeddings doesn't really make sense. So I'm a little bit, I don't feel like I can go back to the stuff that I know really well, and I'm not quite sure what to do with the phrases now. So my big questions are about next steps. What I was just saying. So in some slices of the data, a full 70% of the phrases don't appear in Wikipedia. So if you looked at the departments that showed up in titles, for example, like how is this just, I have to go in by hand? Is there some way I can think about patterns across these ideas that would help me get kind of a handle on what's going on with representation in Wikipedia from this? This is kind of an aside, but I'm also bringing in the role of newspapers. So I have the Chronicling America data set, thinking about that as an intermediate step. Did the phrase show up in the contemporary Chronicling America newspapers? And is that kind of an intermediate step to shepherding it into Wikipedia? So I'm currently running that analysis now to see if I can identify that. Chronicling America, the OCR is awful, 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 awful. So that's a little bit questionable how much we can do with that. And just conceptually what to do about gaps in the archives, difference in writing styles across group, all of the historical issues that are important for any sort of historical analysis comes into it here. So just really kind of thinking about how we do this type of project when the archives are spotty, when there's just issues of style differences and such across these organizations. For example, I have the journal for the National Women's Party, but I have just the writings for Black women. So of course the content is going to be different. And is that kind of going to impact how we think about what's covered? The fact that they're different is also indicative of the way we think about history, by the way. And then just some final thoughts, and then I want to get your thoughts on this. So what I'm thinking of is a targeted comparison, comparing the National League collection to the actual National Consumers League page, Equal Rights Journal to the National Women's Party page. I don't know how to do that with the Black women's writings because there's not a page that's like Black women's writings, right? So I don't know what page I would compare there, or just look at all three collections as a corpus to the history pages as a corpus, and not looking at the phrases, or maybe looking at the phrases, but just directly doing some comparisons there more than just mentions. And one potential idea I have is looking at the idea structures measured via network analysis. So if you were to read the Black women's writing collection and you were to read the Wikipedia history pages, what is the structure of ideas you would see, and how is that different? So that's one concrete idea I have, and it really does borrow from Peter Behrman's work on word networks, also Monica Lee and John Levy Martin's work on semantic networks and that sort of thing. So that's one specific idea that I have, and that's it. What else? What else can I do? How do I get a handle?
Can I ask a question, Laura?
Yeah.
So when you think of the process, not not in quantitative terms, but just sort of in natural language terms, what's your working model in your head of what gets remembered and what doesn't?
I think it would certainly, at least I hypothesize coming in that what certain groups were doing would be more remembered and recorded because they are preserved in the archives more. They were publicized at the time. They were probably in the newspapers at the time. So that was my big initial hypothesis, was there's going to be some demographic effect here where white women, especially middle-class white women, are going to have more control over what gets remembered in history versus other groups. So that's one big model. Yeah, actually, that is the biggest one I had.
Even like Rosa Parks, right? Like my understanding is that her case was publicized as sort of through a media event that was like deliberately orchestrated, like she had organizational support. And I wonder if maybe part of the puzzle is figuring out who had organizational resource support to have their messages magnified in the media. Sorry, I'm just admitting somebody here. Something like that. On a related story, I remember when I was a graduate student having a couple Wikipedia editing wars over Henry Ford's history of anti-Semitism. And there they had a very, very fast, they had like a rapid response team that would contest any mention of Henry Ford's anti-Semitism almost immediately, to the point that I figured it had to be some type of organized effort to, maintain it. So, organizations might not just platform ideas and help immortalize them, but they might actually actively squash them. And I'm wondering if there's some way to do that by tracing the genealogy of an idea that died or didn't, something like that.
Or the edit pages, right? We have the entire history of the edit pages of Wikipedia. So you certainly could pull in that data as well to try and figure out, is there organized efforts on either side to like the number of edits. So I certainly have right away the last edit that was done on the page. So some were edited in 2015, some are currently being edited today. So there's a lot of other data from Wikipedia, which I think could be interesting. I think.
Just one more. I would wonder if the concepts or people that you see featured today, if you look through the news archives, you would find that they commanded a news cycle. Like there was a moment where they captured the national attention and were able to entrench themselves in the collective imagination. And that you could pick up quantitatively, right? Like just the hypothesis would be that you'd have to dominate a news cycle to get the wide attention that would be required for cultural creators to be cognizant of your existence, know your story, and then have the hazard of creating it in more content that's consumed. I wonder.
Yeah, exactly, which is why that Chronicling America data is key there.
Yeah.
Precisely. So if we're looking at the 10% that didn't show up in Wikipedia, or the, whatever that was, 20, 30% that didn't show up in these history pages, is that conditioned on their, not only the presence in the newspapers, but the duration of the presence or the geographical reach of the presence, right? We have the city of the newspapers. So that is precisely, I think, why I would want to bring in the Chronicling America data there.
Okay. May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me now? Did you see any trending between the newer stuff, the newer references for your list of terms being more relevant, like maybe old phrases kind of started to evolve into something new?
Yeah, there is some confounding there, specifically with the way we refer to the Black population. We don't use the term colored anymore. We don't use the term Negro anymore. And that's not the same way with white people. We have always used the phrase white, and we will always, from the foreseeable future, use the phrase white. I mean, women weren't saying Caucasian. They weren't saying the words Caucasian there. We were using Negro and colored. So that is certainly an issue there, specifically with like colored women workers doesn't show up in Wikipedia, but Black women workers might. And so that changes. So that's an important caveat. And it's an interesting problem for Wikipedia in general, is when you talk about these historical events, do you use the phrase that they use themselves, like colored women workers, or do you update that to the modern language, which is Black women workers or African American women workers, which probably nobody would want to use now. So that's a big question. With the other stuff, with the other kind of phrases and departments, you would think that, at least with the departments in particular, you would use the actual department name. If there was a Negro department, you would want to talk about the Negro department in a history book. So there's, you know, different ways of thinking about the way phrases change over time. Tricky to capture computationally, I would say. These phrases changes over time, and I'm not sure what I would do with that. Maybe look, yeah, newspapers, I don't know. My time frame is actually not all that large. It's 1898 to 1954. So there may be some kind of bias toward the 50s, but my guess is actually there's more bias to the first wave movement, because that's where most of history is done. So 1890 to 1920 would be my guess, but I actually could look more into year of creation.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
So this is a really very exciting and amazing project. I really like it. It's really impressive. But like, just to contribute one perspective maybe.
Yeah.
So the way I see Black women writing is like, Black women is in the intersection of racial discrimination and gender discrimination, right?
Yep.
So like right now here, the reference group seems to be like Equal Rights Journal or some National Consumers League. Like the comparative perspective, I think you can further deconstruct, like further break it down to say, what's the difference between Black women's writing versus Black guys' writing? Would they draw even more attention? Like say for males, right? Black males, their movements or their writing, would they actually draw even more attention than Black women? And then also Black women versus white women, like I see like there are multiple dimensions going on there. And also another, because just now, I think at one point you mentioned a lot of phrases, they do appear, like they both appear in Black women's writing and also in Wikipedia, but it's not in Wikipedia's history or movement page or whatever. So like, where do they appear then? What are they associated with? So they do appear in Wikipedia, but not associated with Black women's writing. And then they appear somewhere else, like seems like they were isolated from their original context. Then where did they go and why did they go there? So I think all those directions are worth diving deeper into. And what else? And another, like one last thing, but I think you have already mentioned this because you are now also shifting your attention to compare this with contemporary writing or contemporary memories, I will say, because like right now we thought something is lost to history, right? But probably it's also because we don't even, they just go, they are going actually unnoticed, even at present. Like right now, are we also remembering Black women's writing at this time, like at present? So I think the point is, are they really lost to history, which suggests that they were once remembered, they were once noticed, and then they went lost, or they didn't get any attention at all, and then they just disappear. So that's like several dimensions I was thinking through.
Yeah, and that relates back to, do you guys prefer that I stop sharing my screen so we can see each other, or should I keep my slide?
It's great, yeah.
Stop sharing is great?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Yeah. I always find it so weird talking to these little tiny boxes. Yeah, so that relates back to Joe's comment that looking at the initial process. So Rosa Parks, it wasn't arbitrary that her event became the event. It was actually, they came to her, they specifically, the movement came to her and said, Rosa Parks, we need you to get arrested because we're going to turn your case into a thing. And she had a really great history. She was organized, she didn't have any problematic features. She was an upstanding citizen, etc. So she didn't just get tired and give up her seat. The movement said, you need to do this, Rosa Parks, and we are going to be behind you. So there's a process beyond just simply what do we remember in the process. And so Chronicling America, I think, would again get at that. Was it remembered at the time? So of the 10% of the phrases that aren't in Wikipedia, were they not even mentioned by newspapers? Like, was it truly just a non-starter and nobody was talking about it even at the time? So I think from this conversation, that seems to be the essential next step, is bringing in this Chronicling America data. So I think first response I'm getting is that should be my focus, is looking at that data, because that will be essential. Yeah, there's so many different comparisons here. You know, one of the issues with this came out of the work on intersectionality, is that when we think about the women's movement, we think only about gender. And so the race work that Black women were doing, which was, they were being discriminated against because they were Black, not just because they were women, was so important. And in many cases was more important, because we're talking post-Reconstruction here, and just the absolutely horrific stuff that was happening in the South with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Lynching was a huge part of this Black women's writings. And who are we to say that that's not part of the women's movement? Because it was. I mean, it was led by Black women. Ida B. Wells was one of the foremost people who were doing this stuff. So that process is really interesting to me, that, you know, we construct the women's movement as being so narrow compared to what the participants were thinking about. And that's one of the things that I really am interested in here, and why that difference in the history pages was so important to me. The fact that there was a huge drop in which of the departments mentioned by Black women were in those history pages was a very startling finding to me. And it was not surprising, unfortunately, but it was startling. And I think that really starts to get a handle on how we say, this is the women's movement, this is the history of it. And in fact, that was all history, right? It could have included men's history and the history of race movements, and still we see this big drop off. So that's now where I think there's something there, there's something happening, and we can really kind of get a handle on how we're defining history and such. So one of the questions was like, where does that go? So the phrases that were in Wikipedia but not in those history pages, some of them, you know, some of these groups have their own pages and history is not in the title. So like the Lucy Stone League might have its own page, but when you read the history of the women's movement page, you never see the Lucy Stone League. So how would you go from the history to that page? So now it becomes a matter of like, how much knowledge do you have of the movement, and would you know to search for that page? Probably not if you're trying to learn about it. So then it becomes kind of like a network of knowledge thing.
I have a question. If you're looking for stuff that is mentioned by history, then it strikes me that that is something that is remembered within the history genre or within the institution of academic history. It can still be part of history, like our cultural history, though not recognized as part of history through, you know, formal history or institutionalized history. And I think that might be part of it. I got to think anything that exists today has a traceable echo going through, and somebody made it survive somehow. A journalist, it was in a big book. There's a museum dedicated to it. You know, it looks like it's a history tracing type of thing.
And I do think that 10%, once I do some more targeted cleaning, I mean, there is a question, and I'm interested in, particularly from computational folk, how much cleaning you do. Like, how much do you stick to the original phrases versus, so for example, Black women in particular always used the Miss and Mrs. Miss Ida B. Wells, Mrs. Ida B. Wells Barnett. That doesn't show up in Wikipedia. So I do want to clean out that Miss and Mrs. But in doing that, I'm making a choice to say, I'm not accepting the way you phrased it. And that's like a clear example, but there's other ones as well. So that is a question to me. But anyways, that was a sidetrack. Once I clean that, I actually think that that number will go down to 5, maybe even 3%. And I think you're right. Like virtually everything is recorded, which is impressive and exciting. But that doesn't mean it's easily accessible. You may have to dig deep, deep, deep into Wikipedia and be really knowledgeable in order to find these kind of what we would see as esoteric pages. And why not link to them all in the history page, right? You can do hyperlinks within Wikipedia. And so what's being chosen in the institutionalized history kind of version versus we can dump all of the knowledge we've had ever on the internet, which is fantastic, but it's not the same as putting it in the history page, which is why I wanted to zero in on that. And, you know, I have some idea that I would want to look at actual history textbooks that are taught to kids, right? And so looking at the history pages is as close to an approximation of that I can get. And lots of people do look at history textbooks. So there's that as well. And I do think theoretically and substantively and empirically, it is important, whether it's its own page deep in Wikipedia versus in kind of these general places where it would be the first place you go if you were trying to look at history. So it's definitely the sociology of knowledge, institutionalization, organizations, everything that's kind of my jam, looking at institutions, organizations and such.
I love this, by the way. I really do.
Oh,
one of the things I was thinking of was maybe even who feels the ability or the cultural capital to add to Wikipedia themselves.
Yeah.
You know, that yes, it's not as formalized as a textbook, right? But that it could have an impact, and especially if you're seeing a difference between Black women's rights movement and the centered white women's rights movement. It could be who feels their voice to speak even now, never mind back then. You know,
100%. And we know that women are vastly underrepresented as editors on Wikipedia. And I'm imagining Black women are even less represented. And so that perpetuates what I was just talking about, which is we decide, specifically white people decide what the women's movement is, which gets then into the history pages on Wikipedia. And either because of resources that Black women don't have the time to edit Wikipedia, or they don't feel empowered, or they don't feel invited, they don't do it. And so that voice does not get inserted into our official knowledge. And you know, I can do that by gender. You can look at the editors by gender. Getting the race of editors is incredibly tricky, but 100% I think that is the story. And Wikipedia is really great. They want to include being more inclusive in their editors. And so I think like this research would be very welcomed by them. They would say, okay, here are some gaps. Now we know kind of where we can maybe target and improve our Wikipedia pages. I don't think they would be upset to hear things like this. They would be very open to it. And I know that one of the things that professors sometimes do is they encourage their students to edit a Wikipedia page, to get them as editors, to get them an account, to get them in the process. So one thing that, you know, I could do or somebody could do is say, let's go edit the history pages and make sure that this history is being accurately linked to, right? That could be one potential outcome of this, is identifying where we can improve some of these pages and literally shape the way that the world reads history. I mean, it can be incredibly impactful. 1 trillion people are clicking on Wikipedia every month. If if a fraction of those look at the history of the women's movement page and they're not seeing those Black departments and we put those in, that actually could be pretty impactful.
I kind of want to piggyback on Christine's comment. I had a good friend in grad school who did a dissertation on Wikipedia sort of flame wars, right? So, and particularly in contentious articles, like you could think of like U.S. abortion rights, for instance, where in the early days of Wikipedia, without sort of the infrastructure that exists now, at least to my limited understanding, were highly contentious, like minute by minute edits by people sort of on, you know, either side of the debate, right? And I think like when I'm hearing like one of the things I think might be helpful to push and advance the paper, and I know this may be kind of annoying too, because like this actually might push in a slightly different direction and everyone hates those kind of comments. But like I'm thinking like how Wikipedia is sort of like the last triangular part in this piece. And I think that like even though it is a really cool data source, but I think it's also part of the story itself. And I think like because you're talking about like you know, leveraging the metadata, and I'm kind of wondering, you know, like how the editors themselves are a big part of this story, right? So as sort of like this gatekeeping mechanism, right? And I think like, yeah, you may not be able to get race, but there are actually a lot of more improved algorithms that can actually sort of infer ethnicity now that I know, like there's like the officer piece in PNAS where they use that to kind of infer diversity. And I think like you may be able to kind of like glean at least part of it. Because I think that actually might be sort of a big part that at least reviewers, I would imagine, would sort of harp on, saying, well, you know, like like who gets initially put into Wikipedia, you know, if you were to do some kind of like temporal analysis of like when these different articles start to show up is probably a product of, you know, whom are the editors. And kind of conversely to that, I'm also kind of wondering, you know, Joe and Yunsheng kind of hinted at this. I'm kind of wondering if you could actually look at, you know, one cheap, easy, readily available metadata repository would be academic articles. So you could imagine specific journals of history related to Black history, maybe articles, journals that are curated by HBCUs. Like they would probably be the best sources. Obviously, I would imagine they would probably be more available past the 1950s. But like I think that would actually be a really great source of a sort of, sort of peripheral marginalized knowledge that's well maintained, well curated, and data you could probably readily curate to at least kind of corroborate some of these trends, or potentially even as an additional source. Although that's again, bad me pushing in a different direction. But I think like that's some like data where there is a community of scholars who are sort of curating knowledge that is obviously not in sort of into the mainstream, that would be reflected therefore in Wikipedia, sort of like in this like Fleck kind of esoteric exoteric kind of circles, right, of knowledge.
Yeah, and JSTOR now has a research bench where you have access to the entire JSTOR, full text of the entire JSTOR, which is really nice.
Oh, cool.
Oh, it's a great resource. So it would be Chronicling America to kind of pick up the contemporary attention economy. It would be JSTOR to pick up the academic attention economy, and then looking at how that triangulates or compares to Wikipedia, which is the, whatever we want to call that, popular attention economy.
Yeah, I think of like, like exoteric and esoteric circles where it's sort of, academics who are kind of at the core of like producing and maintaining and perpetuating knowledge, and then more sort of others, which are more, common folk, more activists, more, sort of using the knowledge in different ways. I think that might be a kind of a, like maybe a helpful frame for it.
Can I piggyback on that idea? Or I have two comments. One is if it gets narrowed down to names, like, and the question is who gets remembered, I wonder if that would be way easier to do, like a way smaller job of cleaning.
It would.
Better to, yeah. And then the other thing is I wonder if you go into the Wikipedia edit histories of a lot of these pages. I remember from my own experience as a Wikipedian, a lot of esoteric topics are developed mainly by a limited number of super contributors. And I would wonder if there are super contributors who have read specific books and basically integrated into the Wikipedia content. And you could find out like the people who these super contributors are contributing, have they been mentioned in a book, a history book or something like that? I wonder if that's sort of a mechanism that might be at work here.
Well, so if we think about IMDb, can you guys imagine the most well-researched movie on IMDb?
No.
Star Wars.
Oh, of course.
And it's these really nerdy groups of white boys who love Star Wars and will detail in great. Yeah, IMDb is similar to Wikipedia. It's user. Yes. Okay, so not just white, but it's usually men. More women these days, actually, as it's becoming Disneyfied. More women are getting into it. But so IMDb is similar, where it's user content, users contribute and put in these like details, like really obscure details about movies. And Star Wars is really well detailed. I mean, the most esoteric fact about Star Wars you could find on IMDb, but you probably couldn't for, I don't know, a lot of these not that type of movie things. And I'm guessing a similar thing happens on Wikipedia, where you just get these nerds who are super interested and they're like, I am going to make sure Wikipedia has every freaking detail that I can imagine and it's well cited and all of that. And as somebody, sorry, I can't see the names, that Sophia was saying, or somebody was saying, it's not Black women who are doing this. They're not often the ones taking the time to be really super nerdy about it and making sure it all gets on Wikipedia. So that I think is definitely a mechanism.
And I can at least say, at least from my friend's dissertation, that she found overwhelmingly the super editors that sort of Joe referenced are overwhelmingly white men in the U.S., at least in the English language. Like, so it's not a very diverse or heterogeneous group. One other kind of thought that came to mind too is like when you were talking about Star Wars, I know like Star Wars and like other kind of like fandoms like Star Trek, which I'm a big fan of like The Walking Dead, other things have like these Wikipedia ecosystems where they
wiki,
are.
right? Yep.
Yeah, they have their own wikis, which are sort of an independent system, or rather knowledge ecosystem than Wikipedia. And I don't know, like maybe is there something similar to like to women's movements where if there's like a unique history Wikipedia of like I don't know, like of like traditional Black history, women's history that may be curated, because there seems to be a Wikipedia for everything these days. And I'm kind of wondering how that would corroborate with like standard like sort of the mainstream Wikipedia.
Yeah. I have no idea, actually. I'm not in that the wikis, not the Wikipedia, but the wikis.
The wikis,
so
yeah.
I'm really curious if there's a women's movement wiki and that. So that is something I'm going to look up right away. So I know there's just a few minutes left, but I'm still, and this gives me all sorts of ideas going forward. I'm still a little stuck on, yes, I can look at who is mentioned, which I think is much more tractable and easier to classify. And we can very easily say, this is a Black woman, white woman. So absolutely. But I really do want to think about ideas as well, like equal rights, like social uplift. So are there any thoughts on how I deal with not people and organizations and departments, which I have a clear idea in my head how I would do that, but clustering ideas, grouping ideas, looking for themes across ideas, keeping in mind that I want to bring in Chronicling America and maybe now even JSTOR. I mean, I still think actually networks are my best approach for this in some ways, because I don't want to lose that. I really do want to think about not just people, but ideas that are proposed.
I would defer to my big data colleagues, which I'm not one of, but maybe one way to do this is as an exploratory technique where you just identify things that lived and died and have to trace them out qualitatively on some level. I know that you're looking for a computational fix. Maybe,
I don't mind qualitative analysis. That's a big part of my research pipeline. So it would really just be looking at these case studies and saying, here's a cluster of ideas from these different collections that didn't make it, and just kind of really doing a deep dive. I don't mind that, actually, doing just a few case studies. I think that could be really potentially very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's sort of like seems like the lowest hanging fruit would be to like do at least a case study, because it's going to be both an analytic and methodological effort to once you identify what that is, and then learning how to scale it to then identify these other ideas in your corpus. So I think like maybe starting out with something that's like well concrete and well defined, and kind of like working reverse engineering it might be the best approach.
I like that. And then I can bring in all of these ideas about like who's editing it, who is not editing it, and all that other metadata, because throwing all of that stuff in with 5,700 phrases is going to be a lot of noise.
Ouch.
But
go off with chart. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
One of the things.
Sorry.
Go ahead. You go, Hung Wei. Go. Unmute.
I have a silly idea which may not be helpful, but it's similar to Charlie's, but it's in the opposite direction. So I happen to read a couple of children's books on women's suffrage movement, because this year happened to be the centennial, right? So I noticed that like in some children's books have a glossary on the back, and it kind of summarize some like the key events or key ideas, like right, because it's targeted at like children, not like the high school history book or like academic work, right? So it has to kind of like boil down to the most important and significant ideas in the children, women's suffrage movement. So I think that maybe, to me, that's very helpful, as someone who is learning American history by reading children's book.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing is that what I realized that I think it was after I read like 4 or 5 books on the same topic, and I came across to a book that mentioned that has a chapter talking about this African American woman figure in the women's suffrage movement. So I didn't think about it back then, but I wonder if the first like 4 or 5 books that didn't mention this African American woman was published in the early period, maybe in the 90s or in the early 2000s. And as we are constantly rediscovering history, right? So let's go back to Joe's idea that the materials are always there, right? People made a mark on history. Materials are there, but as contemporary people or scientists, we are just rediscovering materials. So my impression is that since the movie Hidden Figure came out, I've seen many more books about this female computer scientist, right, who contribute a lot in the early days of the computer era. And so we are just constantly rediscovering the history. So this idea like how we are the process of rediscovering history itself is kind of like I don't know. To me it's kind of interesting. Like why 4 books didn't mention that African American women at all, and then maybe I think the book I read talking about this African American woman maybe published like very recently. So
I mean,
yeah,
it's socially determined, right? It's Black Lives Matter movement goes up, and the history mentions of the. I mean, yeah, it's absolutely not arbitrary what we rediscover and remember. I mean, the Racy Taylor stuff came out on the tails of the Me Too movement, where it was like, actually, Black women in the civil rights movement got their start in sexual harassment movements, and that was not arbitrary that came out in that period when everybody was talking about it. I love the idea of glossaries actually in indexes. So now I'm going to think about that as a potential, because that's a cool ready-made like cluster of ideas, book indexes and stuff. That's great. It's a great idea. Yeah.
To jump over what Charlie was saying before about a case study, maybe if you look at one that didn't make it at all, but like in history, we remember the winners, right? Like the Rosa Parks, there was a successfulness out of it, right? And we don't remember really the one that wasn't successful. So almost deconstructing in a way some of the ideas that you have or the keywords that you have, those movements or what they're discussing that didn't make it, that weren't successful. We always remember the winners. And to see the difference with that, I think is super interesting, especially with the idea that's really out there right now about decolonizing education. About this, what we remember is being told by the successful movements or the successful people rather than the unsuccessful people. So understanding how much falls off based on that.
Mm-hmm. I'm just now trying to think of a way to measure success, because
there's also the science of science literature and sociology of innovation literature that talks about like the death of ideas. Obviously, in this case, it's science, right? I'm blanking on some references. I'll send them to you, but like this is actually of increased interest to see like which concepts, how things actually fizzled. So granted, like in the case of science, but I mean there is like social movements. There is like an intersection within the sort of the sociology of science. So I think that actually might be at least like some theoretical use to you to kind of piggyback what Christine was saying, to kind of think about a little bit too.
Yeah, definitely. Death of ideas.
I think we're at our bewitching hour. I don't want to keep anyone over, but we'll definitely send you any emails if we have a late night inspiration of something to look at. But Laura, thank you so much for joining us. This is super fascinating. Please come back again once as you develop this. We'd love to host you again, hear this idea or hear new ideas. This has been really fantastic.
Well, it's been way more helpful for me than it probably was for you. So I really appreciate the opportunity to just bounce these ideas off an expert crowd and figure out what to do next, because I was a little bit stuck, but now I'm not stuck. I have lots of ideas going.
That's what we like to hear. And I love the rake thing. The rake thing was like, I actually was not familiar with it. So I was like super.
I love rake. I mean, it's a lot of false positives. So just be cautious, but the true positives are freaking gold sometimes. So it's great. I was really like, there's no way this is going to work. No way this is going to work. And then I was like, wow, this actually worked. This is great.
Which is rare in like a lot of like NLP stuff, because like most of the stuff out there, like it's usually kind of crap. I'm sure you and John, you could attest to too as well. Like it's a lot of it's not that great, sure. But when it hits well, you're like, wonderful.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.